Right. Um, our special guest today is Professor Nidesh Lawtoo. Good afternoon, Professor Lawtoo. And good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So time to formally introduce our speaker today. Nidesh Lawtoo is a philosopher and professor of modern contemporary European literature and culture at Leiden University, Netherlands. He was the PI of the ERC-funded Homo Mimeticus project, 2016 to 2022, whose goal is to inaugurate a new theory of mimesis at the intersection of philosophy, literature, and politics. He has written 6 monographs that inaugurate the transdisciplinary field of mimetic studies, including most recently Homo Mimeticus, a new theory of imitation, and there is Violence and the Edible Unconscious, Volume 1, the Catharsis Hypothesis and Violence and the Mimetic Unconscious, Volume 2, and of course, the Effective Hypothesis. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Lawtoo. And
pleasure is mine.
And yes, thank you for agreeing to this interview immediately. It was such a pleasant surprise. So in our discussion today on, I have named it The Art of Imitation and the Desire for Violence, the Rebirth of Homo Mimeticus. We will try to grasp the emerging concepts around mimesis, New Age violence, and the return of the Homo Mimeticus. And for the audience, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. So let's begin. My first question for Professor Lawtoo, here it is. So let me begin with the most fundamental question that concerns your book, Homo Mimeticus, which is absolutely fantastic work. So how do you define and defend the name, nature, and essence of the species Homo Mimeticus? Because we're also deviating from Homo sapiens that way. So that's my first question.
Thanks very much, Asijit. First of all, for the kind invitation and the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about Homo Mimeticus and the theory of imitation behind it, because it is a book that develops a new theory of imitation, that being the subtitle of it. So why that name? Indeed, in many ways, the theory of Homo Mimeticus is opposed to the notion that there is an essence or a fixed nature to human beings. It is in many ways a critique of the ideal of Homo sapiens, the idea that we are wise creatures, a concept that was introduced by Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, and was based on this idea that we are purely rational, autonomous, solipsistic creatures who, through the power of reason, can easily achieve the status of wisdom. And I think that if you look around today, we are very far removed from this essence or ideal essence of wisdom. We've seen it in many ways during the pandemic crisis, the belief in irrational conspiracy theories. We've seen it with the rise of what I call new fascist movements that generate violent emotions. We see it with war on different fronts, so we are far removed. And the idea of proposing a theory of Homo Mimeticus is to provide a correction or a supplement to the idea of Homo sapiens and add that we are a protean species that has many faces or many masks. We are creators of tools or Homo faber. We're certainly in for making profits of Homo economicus. We have beliefs in religion of Homo religiosus. So we like to play Homo ludens. So there is a plurality internal to our species. And I felt like adding Homo mimeticus because my hypothesis is that imitation, and therefore not an essence, or not something that is immutable in nature, but what we do in terms of imitation is fundamental to our transformations. And so I defend the notion of Homo mimeticus, if it needs to be defended, by saying that the mimeticus somehow problematizes any notion of essence or unique nature that it might be present in the notion of homo. And what mimesis, or the theories of mimesis that I propose, is not linked to sameness, that we are all sharing the same nature, but to differences, cultural differences, religious differences, gender differences, racial differences, and so on. So that would be a beginning to answer your important question.
Right. So what is the foundation of mimetic studies then that you're proposing in your book? And how does it deviate from the older mimetic theories?
Right. In many ways, this book that you mentioned, Homo Mimeticus, is part of a broader project with the same title, Homo Mimeticus. An ERC project that you mentioned was funded for 5 years. And the idea that emerged during the project actually was to provide a new interdisciplinary field, which I called mimetic studies, to study the protean manifestations of mimesis, because mimesis or imitation operates on a plurality of ways. I mean, one can imitate individually, but also collectively. There is imitation at the psychological level, but if you talk to neuroscientists, they will tell you that we have neurons in the brain that are responsible for imitation, or that facilitate imitation. There is imitation in technical simulations, and so on and so forth. So hence the need of mimetic studies. I want to emphasize the plurality of approaches, which is different from previous mimetic theories or mimetic theory. Of course, the notion of mimesis is a Greek notion. So there are plenty of mimetic theories to draw in the philosophical tradition, starting with Plato and Aristotle. And I rely on those broad shoulders and draw on a number of different figures. But maybe the closer theory that I'm engaging critically with is the one of René Girard, who was a French literary critic, theorist, also interested in anthropology. And so when people speak of mimetic theory in the 21st century, usually they have in mind René Girard's mimetic theory. And mimetic studies is intended as an alternative, and it's not necessarily in opposition to Girard, but an expansion of his theory of mimetic desire. And maybe if you want me, I can say a little bit more about the way mimetic studies differs from Girard's mimetic theory.
Mm-hmm. I think we also have a question on that. But so to delve deeper into a little deeper into mimesis. So how does mimesis as an embodied relational and affective dimension transform our ego into a porous phantom-like thing? And you've also elucidated about this in your brilliant book, The Phantom Ego. So are you indirectly referring to the intentional consciousness of phenomenology? Because consciousness cannot be a singular thing; it's always consciousness of something. So how do you read our transformation of the ego through mimesis?
Right. So you're referring now to the book that actually sets the foundations for mimetic studies. Before the Homo Mimeticus books, 10 years ago, I had published a book titled The Phantom of the Ego. And the phrase is a quote. It's a citation from Nietzsche, who in Daybreak, he says that modern man doesn't have an ego that is autonomous and solipsistic and independent, but only a phantom of the ego, a phantom von ego. And Nietzsche was a philologist by training. So when he uses the notion of phantom, what I think is referring to, or what I argue is referring to, is the Platonic idea of mimesis as a phantom of reality, a phantom or a shadow of the ideal. But Nietzsche, being an immanent anti-Platonic thinker, brings this vertical ontology that he inherits from Plato down to earth and argues, well, it's not a phantom of an ideal ego, it's a phantom of another ego, or of a plurality of egos, for instance, in a crowd, or what he calls a herd. So he psychologizes the notion of the phantom, the Platonic notion of the phantom. Now, Nietzsche comes before phenomenology, but I would argue that his attention to the relational, intersubjective dimension of mimesis, the fact that the ego automatically or unconsciously copies other egos can be as a starting point, can be taken as a starting point for phenomenological accounts. In my starting point, I have Nietzsche as a genealogical link between the ancients and the moderns. And I don't draw all that much on phenomenology in that book, but I do more explicitly in the more recent books on violence. And I would say that figures that are important, in addition to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, would be phenomenologists like Michel Henry, who is actually critical of the notion of intentionality, because there is an unintentional dimension internal to mimesis. So I'm selective in my approach to phenomenology, and I would say that Nietzsche and Michel Henry are the phenomenological figures that I draw from in order to think about subjectivity in relational terms. So that is indeed something that it shares with phenomenology.
Right. And in your book, there is this paradigmatic shift from the Girardian perspective of mimesis that you just mentioned as desire, sacrifice, and violence to the more Nietzschean affirmative mimesis. How do you negotiate this movement from a typically Freudian interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power, not as being or becoming, but as a pathos, feeling, so to say?
Right. So I mentioned before that mimetic studies is a supplement to Girard's mimetic theory. And René Girard has this, I think it can be considered a precursor of what I call the mimetic turn. Because when you speak of mimesis, to use the Greek pronunciation, we tend to think of art as an imitation of nature. That is still the dominant definition of mimesis, I would say, in both philosophy and literary studies and aesthetics. And what I call the mimetic turn, I'm interested in shifting the notion of mimesis from aesthetics to subjectivity, to the fact that humans are mimetic creatures. And in that sense, René Girard is a precursor because he speaks about the imitative nature of our desires. He calls it mimetic desire. Now, at the same time, I think that that is still a restricted theory of mimesis, because we could ask ourselves, why only desires are mimetic? Why restrict the theory to desire only? And if we study a theory genealogically, that is, we don't take the theory just, okay, desires are mimetic because René Girard said so, but let's see what are his influences. Then I would argue that Girard was very much influenced by Freud, by focusing on desire, and particularly triangular structures in which the subject desire what the model desires as an ambivalent relationship with a father figure. Very often it's a male scenario. And rivalry and the scapegoating mechanisms ensue. I think that's a Freudian structure. So you mentioned that my starting point is Nietzsche. By starting with Nietzsche's notion of pathos, and Nietzsche is a philologist, uses this Greek term pathos, which is linked to pentos, suffering, but it's much more than that for the Greeks. For the Greeks, pathos is an affect, it's an emotional force that has the power to take possession of the ego and dispossess it. And it's not linked to desire. I mean, desire can operate as a pathos, but it can also be positive. Enthusiasm could be a pathos. Or a joy, gay science could be a pathos as well. So the shift from mimetic desire to mimetic pathos allows me to move away from a triangular structure that always determines mimesis towards a negative, rivalrous, and violent component. And basically, it's a way of bringing mimesis beyond good and evil, to use the Nietzschean phrase. The pathos can go both ways. It can be violent and pathological, but it can also be life affirmative. And that, for me, provides a more open and more flexible starting point to develop mimetic studies, that it's not framed in a triangular Oedipal structure.
Right. To move a little bit from mimesis as pathos to a more connected phenomenon of mimesis as contagion. So when you're talking of mimesis as contagion, do you only refer to the trance-like intoxicative interflows of violence in fascism or racial genocides and totalitarian regimes. So do you only refer to mimesis in its negative connotation when you're referring to mimesis as contagion?
Right. So that follows naturally from the previous question, because if mimesis goes beyond good and evil, then it has both good and bad manifestations. And it's true that the obvious manifestations of contagion are more visible in its violent side, in violent behavior in a crowd, in neo-fascist or neo-fascist movements. And I would say there I'm close to Girard. Girard is also attentive to the contagion dimension of violence. I note that the notion of contagion was developed by crowd psychologists in the 19th century already. People like Gustave Le Bon, who developed crowd psychology, noted that people in a crowd are particularly vulnerable to violent, aggressive emotions. And it took the notion of contagion from Pasteur. So, of course, after the pandemic crisis, we think of contagion, we think of viral contagion, and it is a term that it's connoted negatively in that sense. But at the same time, Le Bon wasn't the only crowd psychologist. Another important figure for mimetic studies is a French psychologist called Gabriel Tarde, who has been forgotten a little bit in the 20th century, but thanks to figures like Bruno Latour and Gilles Deleuze, is coming back. And Tarde argued that society is composed of contagious fluxes of imitation that are not necessarily bad. They can be good. They give social cohesion to the community. So to answer your question, I would say no. Contagion, like mimesis, goes beyond good and evil. The pathological manifestations of contagion are most visible and easy to see, but every time we go to a concert, we experience by contagion emotions of enthusiasm and pleasure and joy by being part of a positive group. So I would say that that positive contagion that Girard doesn't emphasize should equally be explored by mimetic studies. Because if you want to counter neo-fascist movements, then it is not sufficient to stay away from mimesis. We need to promote positive, contagious, and affirmative democratic modes of being in common that are very much in line with what a recent sociologist, Harmut Rosa, calls resonance. Yeah, Harmut Rosa is a German sociologist who argues that we should pay attention to the way people resonate effectively with others. And resonance is a primarily positive concept, and contagion can be resonating in positive ways as well.
Right. So it's quite intriguing how you move from inside Plato's cave to Le Corlabart's impact of theatrical mimesis on the plastic soul. I love the phrase plastic soul. So are you suggesting that there is perpetually a game of identification and hypnosis between the actor and the audience? So here I'm also referring to your decoding of Woody Allen's Zelig. Fantastic film, but yes.
Yes, that's a very interesting question that brings together many figures from Plato to La Coulabart and to Woody Allen Zelig, which I discuss indeed in the Homo Mimeticus book. So let me start by going step by step, maybe, and starting with Plato and the allegory of the cave. I mean, it's a very well-known allegory that we often use to introduce students to philosophy. And what is often emphasized in the allegory is that the prisoners at the bottom of the cave, chained and looking forward and seeing the shadows, mistake the shadows for reality. So the concerns are more epistemological. It's a question of truth. The shadows for Plato are just appearances, and it's a matter of liberating one of the prisoners and moving out of the cave in order to be exposed to the truth, to the idea of the sun, which stands for the idea of the good. It's an allegory. So everything is allegorical. And if philosophers have paid much attention to, let's say, what the sun represents, the idea of the good, or the freed prisoner is the philosopher, and the shadows, well, the shadows are a little bit more tricky because the shadows, on the one hand, for Plato, are the world of phenomena, but actually the shadows are themselves representations of a kind of a puppet show behind. People are holding up the figures, and so there are two removes. So the shadows are allegorical of what we could call artistic representations, theatrical and tragic spectacles. But what about the chains? That was my question in that chapter. What are the chains allegorical of? Why should the prisoners? Why should they be prisoners? I mean, if this is an allegory of the polis of the Greek city, they're free, right? Yes, they are slaves, but it seems that this allegory doesn't apply to the slaves only. It applies to the Athenian across the board. So why are there chains if they're free? And my argument is that those shadows are not only illusions, false appearances, but have a magnetizing power over the audience. Plato is thinking about the theater. He's writing in what is called by Eric Avalok, the great scholar of Plato, an oral culture where people go to the theater in order to learn about the gods, for instance, or learn about heroic behavior. And the theater has a magnetic power over the audience. And in another dialogue titled Ion, Plato speaks of the figure of the reciter of Homer, the one who recites Homer. So people don't read the Iliad. They go to the theater to watch the Iliad or to watch a dramatization of the Iliad. And he speaks of a long chain that goes from Apollo to the poet to the muses, that it's magnetic. So that like a magnetism transfers the property of magnetism to an iron chain. It creates a long chain that magnetizes the audience. And my intuition, and I share it actually with another classicist and good friend of mine, who is Adriana Cavarero, which I think you interviewed as well. She's an ally in mimetic studies, is that the chain in Ion, in the dialogue Ion, is the same chain that Plato discusses in the allegory of the cave. So that there are indeed magnetizing properties at play in speaking shadows. The shadows are speaking because there is an echo in the cave, and they have the power, to use a more modern term, not to magnetize but to hypnotize the audience. And so the prisoners can move the head, because as any of us have experienced, whenever you're watching a movie or playing a video game, it's very difficult to break free, right? Plato is sensing that power. It's an invisible power. It's an imperceptible power, Deleuze would say, that is at play in mimesis, a Dionysian power. And and so when I tie it to Zelig, I have that genealogy in mind, because in the movie Zelig, you have a moment in which, for instance, the doctor, played by Mia Farrow, the figure of the doctor, directs this kind of spiraling structure to the audience and hypnotizes Zelig, but also hypnotizes the audience. And that, to come to Lacoue-Labarthe, who is a French philosopher who is also very interested in mimesis and plays a key role in the book, has the power to kind of operate on what Plato called the plastic shape of the soul, of the human soul, so that those images have a material effect. And there is a way of reading Plato against Plato, if you want, and seeing in him a diagnostic concern with the material psychological effects of simulacra and simulations that are not just illusory, but actually chain us and have the power to shape us. So that is what I'm paying attention to in that particular chapter. I call it a vita mimetica because philosophers very often speak about the vita contemplativa, right? Outside of the cave, the life of the mind. And Arendt speaks of the vita activa, which is the sphere of politics and action. And I think we need to add a third element, which is the vita mimetica, which is all the time that we are exposed to simulacra and simulations, we are engaging in that. And it's not by itself negative. We are in the vita mimetica right now. Right, we are speaking to simulacra, and we are trying to develop a theory of mimesis through a simulacrum. So it's not necessarily a bad hypnosis. A relational hypnotic relation can also be imbued with thought. So emotions and reason are not opposed the way I see it.
Right. So taking a cue from there, so it's interesting to note how you, for you, um, sim pathos, feeling with, and you've divided it, sim and pathos, feeling with, comes so close to Donna Haraway's sympoiesis, which is also collective, a kind of a collective evolution or collaborative growing with. So, however, I'm more interested in understanding your division of pathology into pathos and logos, into affect and reason as both disease and cure. So, how are you building upon these negative and positive effects of mimesis?
Right. Yes, it's a very interesting question because when I first started thinking about mimesis, I was noticing that philosophers like Nietzsche, for instance, tend to denounce the pathological effects of mimetic behavior. What we talked about, the crowd, the mimetic crowd, the violence that spreads through the crowd, the irrational dimension of being in common and not thinking individually. And so, in that sense, yes, in theories of mimesis and mimetic studies, there is a strong awareness that mimetic contagion in the negative sense can lead to all kinds of social pathologies or political pathologies, from new fascist movements to conspiracy theories. What I also found interesting is that the diagnostic is never clear cut, and that in addition to a critical distancing from mimetic contagion and the pathologies it generates, very often figures like Nietzsche or Georges Bataille or Lacour acknowledge the power of affect in generating a critique. So the critique or the logos, the critical logos, is not opposed to an emotional contagion. Nietzsche uses the phrase, well, it's actually Plato, and Nietzsche transforms it. Plato says that only the wounded physician can heal. So that you have to be sick or you have to have a certain experience with sickness in order to cure. And Nietzsche in Ecce Homo says that seine längste Übung, his longest exercise, and Ecce Homo is a book that he writes at the end of his life, this longest exercise has been to look at sickness from the perspective of health and at health from the perspective of sickness. And I took that perspectivism, which is the other term that he uses, as a starting point to explain this paradoxical idea that being affected by a mimetic affect, by a mimetic pathology, can be the necessary first step in order to develop what I call a mimetic patho/logy. That is a critical logos, a diagnostic account of mimetic pathos. And the assumption there too is that in order to develop a strong critique, it's not sufficient to put oneself at a radical distance from the phenomenon that we analyze. We need a degree of experiential affective exposure. In that sense, there is a link with phenomenology. A lived affective experience is necessary in order to develop a strong critique. And so when I speak about pathos and logos, I want to emphasize that mimetic studies shouldn't simply focus on the logos and the different pathologies like psychology or anthropology, all these different perspectives to study mimesis, but they should also engage with the affective dimension. And that's maybe where aesthetics and literature plays a major role. For me, there's always been a question of how to link the arts, aesthetics, film, literature with philosophy. And I feel that our educative system is built still very much in a Platonic way, in an academic Platonic way. Plato had a school, he called it the academy. And when we pursue academic careers, we're still very much trapped within Platonic structures in which it's either philosophy or literature. And I think that that's not even faithful to Plato, because if one reads Plato carefully, one obviously notices that he is very much using literary techniques like the dialogue, the Socratic dialogue, which is written in mimetic speech, allegories that I mentioned, the allegory of the cave, heroes of knowledge with which we are bound to identify. So it's reductive to Platonists as well to look at philosophy and to look at mimesis only from the point of view of rational discourse. Obviously, the affective dimension is important. And that has to do with the fact that mimesis, the Greek term, comes from mimos, actor, or performance. So it's rooted in bodily performance. And so if one develops a theory of imitation, one should be aware not only of theorizing it from a distance, theorein, to see from a distance, but also to account for the dramatic affective powers of Homo Mimeticus. And that's one of the things that the book and mimetic studies attempt to do.
Right. So taking the cue from my last question also, while referring to negative impacts of on affective plastic subjects, the negative impacts of mimesis on plastic subjects, which results in a complete mutation of one's character, are you drawing your understanding from Malabou's notion of destructive plasticity?
Right. So I'm teaching Catherine Malabou, or was teaching Catherine Malabou last week, who is also a good friend and an ally of mimetic studies. And indeed, there are interesting connections between mimesis and plasticity. Both concepts come out of aesthetics originally. Plasticity, you think of the plastic arts. I said mimesis is usually the representation, imitation of nature. But both Catherine Malabou and I are interested in looking at plasticity, her, and in my case, mimesis, in subject formation. So how subjectivity itself, it's plastic and mimetic. And at the same time, she also argues that plasticity has this kind of double ability of receiving form and giving form. And I've paid attention to the fact that there is a passive and an active form of imitation. And Malabou engages with the neurosciences. So when she speaks about plasticity, she speaks about Hegel, but she is also engaging with what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity. And mimetic studies also draws on theories of mirror neurons. We might come back to that again later. So I wouldn't say that I draw on her notion of explosive plasticity, but I think that there are connections between plasticity and mimesis. I think her theory of plasticity, with kind of endowed with explosive power, is more Hegelian and dialectic, based on the power of negation. And my focus is more Nietzschean. And Nietzsche speaks also about himself being dynamite, right? So when I started thinking about mimesis, I wasn't aware of Malabou's work yet, but in recent years, we've been discussing the resonances between plasticity and mimesis. So it's something that we are constructing and actually co-authoring a part of a booking project. So that discussion is continuing, but it's in progress.
Okay, that's wonderful. So again, a very straightforward question. So do you think Nietzsche's Homo Mimeticus, Nietzsche's version that you draw from also, can help us in moving towards collaborative post-human interrelationships?
Right. Well, it's an interesting question. Indeed, for me, starting with mimetic pathos, once again, instead of mimetic desire, is a way of emphasizing the human fragility, vulnerability, and relationality that is present from birth. Nietzsche says that humans are animals that are born too soon. And so for many years, right, we are vulnerable and dependent, and we require parents and then family and educators and so forth. Very different from other animals who, after already a couple of minutes, can walk around on their own. They still need protection, but they're way more independent. So that it's very important for humans to understand each other quickly. That is a theory that Nietzsche develops in gay science. And this idea of sympathy, not as a moral sympathy, but as a feeling with. is, according to Nietzsche, essential for survival, to understand what the other intentions are. Are they good intentions or not? Should I trust this face or not? Newborns are very good at that, on reading faces. That also opens up the human to the other and to plastic transformations that now are increasingly, let's say, influenced by new technologies. And so it's maybe not an accident that Nietzsche has been appropriated by post-humanist and transhumanist thinker. I've engaged with these debates, and I think you were part of that conference as well. I wouldn't think that Nietzsche is in line with transhumanism as a philosophy. Nietzsche was very much interested in rooting subjectivity in the body, remaining faithful to the earth. So I would imagine him to be very critical to transhumanist ideals of immortality or transferring to other planets. That's not very Nietzschean. On the contrary, it's Platonic in the negative sense. But I think that there is a way of appropriating Nietzsche for posthuman studies, indeed, because I've invited Catherine Hales, for instance, in this conference on posthumanism, and Catherine Hales, in How We Became Posthuman, argued that cybernetics lost track of the fact that humans have a body, a biology that makes it very difficult to download consciousness in a computer or in artificial intelligence. And I think Nietzsche can be used to think about modes of being in common and together that are embodied, relational, and to think critically as well about both the pathologies of posthumanism and the pathologies where there is a potential, because once again, mimesis is not good or bad. It can cut both ways. So it's not a question of opposing technology, but putting it to use to affirmative ends. So I would argue, yes, there is work to be done on posthumanism, and I'm currently editing or co-editing a book on posthumanism titled Homo Mimeticus 2.0, posthuman mimesis in art, philosophy, and techniques, where it's also a question of engaging with figures like Hales, I mentioned, Braidotti, Stigler, and others. But that's a work in progress that is coming as a supplement, a posthuman supplement to mimetic studies.
Oh, that's great. So let us discuss your book, Balance and the Mimetic Unconscious, which released last year. So human history has always been the history of balance. We know that. But so we are born with balance in our behavior and also learn it through imitation along the way. So from public execution in the Middle Ages to slow death by prolonged torture to suicide bombing and gas chambers in modern times and drone warfare, everything falls under the broad category of balance. So my question is, are humans answering to some kind of primal, instinctual call for balance towards the other by inventing new methods with every passing age? Similarly, what is it about balance that invokes disgust when observed from a critical, objective distance and pleasure when one is themselves the perpetrator?
Very difficult question, which is indeed not the question I immediately address in those books on violence and the unconscious, where it's more a question of the effects of media violence, but it's related. As I said, my starting point is mimetic pathos and sympathos. I think that our immediate answer or response to a new life is not through violence, but through sympathy. And I think that that is fundamental to human cooperation. We have survived as a species because of our ability to cooperate. Alone, we're pretty vulnerable in the wilderness. So I think that should be emphasized. And yet at the same time, it would be idealist to deny the fact that we have the ability to develop violent drives as well. And that is constitutive of Homo mimeticus. So I'm not falling back into the ideal of Homo sapiens, that we're fully rational and sympathetic creature, but I'm also not being restricted to the Girardian idea that violence is the natural consequence of our mimetic desires and that only a scapegoating mechanism can put an end to violence. I'm not a specialist of this, but I think that if you take the assumption that we are relational creatures and that we are driven by a pathos or sympathos, which is not moralistic, we must be ready in terms of evolutionary development to respond very quickly both to signs of sympathy and collaboration and to signs of aggression. And aggression generates mimetically aggression. There is a mirroring effect there. I mentioned mirror neurons, which are motor neurons, that is, neurons responsible for movement that activate not only when we move, let's say I grab a glass of water, which I need, by the way. But as I do so, your neurons in the brain are activated, they're responsible for movement, for grabbing, are activated as well. And neuroscientists call them mirror neurons, and they argue that they're responsible for imitation and also for understanding the intentions of others. And my argument is that this is, I think, very true and interesting. Nietzsche had a very similar hypothesis, by the way, but they might also be responsible for responding to violence with violence, so that there is this mirroring relationship with violence. Is it something that is part of our history? I think yes. If you look at history, it's a history of violence and reciprocal violence, and we see it in the daily news when we see what happens in Gaza right now and the escalation that ensues. Now, what was your second question? You had a follow-up question to the question of violence.
So what I was trying to ask is what is it about violence that invokes disgust when observed from a critical objective distance and pleasure when one is, themselves the perpetrator?
Right, yes. Yeah, the mystery of the pleasurability of violence was mentioned already by Aristotle in the Poetics. How come when we look at violent or even these bodies, dead bodies, that's the example that Aristotle gives in the Poetics, the beginning of aesthetic theory, that there is pleasure involved from a representational distance, right? And disgust at the same time. Remember, I spoke about this pathos of distance, that it's the Nietzschean concept that I use as a foundation for mimetic studies. Once I acknowledge that I'm vulnerable to pathos, be it good or bad, that doesn't mean that I cannot put myself at a critical distance from it. There is thus not a triangle, but an oscillation between attraction to pathos, including violent pathos, and distance or disgust. Georges Bataille, who is a Nietzschean interdisciplinary figure, also very important for mimetic studies, speaks of attraction and repulsion, which is the term that you used. What is it that makes us oscillate in such a way? Well, it's a difficult question, but I would say there is a difference indeed if what is at stake is an aesthetic representation or simulation, let's say a tragedy or a novel or a movie or a video game in which we know that it's simulated. And there, maybe our mirror neurons are stimulated to kind of enjoy the thrill of adrenaline generated by violence while knowing that there is no danger for ourselves because we are at a distance. I don't know how that works.
Is it context specific then? Is it context specific then? Like,
Say that again?
Is it context specific then? Which makes a Nazi officer, carry Jew heads as if it's nothing. At the same time, cry when their, children are harmed. So does violence depend entirely on context then? That, I can distance myself when I know it's not personal. It's representational, maybe.
Right. Well, I think here, I'm a philosopher, but I'm also a literary theorist, literary critic. And so indeed, it does matter if it's mediated by a given medium. It matters if it's a tragedy or a novel or a film and so forth. So it's not only context, but it's the medium. McLuhan's phrase, the medium is the message, I think applies to violence as well. And whenever we are confronted with representations of violence, we should pay attention to questions of form as well. How is it filmed? From what angle? What is the intention behind the camera movement and so forth? in violence in real life, I think operates on a much more direct visceral level. If I'm involved in a scene of violence, I think that depending again on context, whether there is an opposition in a war, us versus them, ideology can blind us to the humanity of the other. And yet at the same time, I think that there is something in all humans that responds viscerally with sympathy uh, and compassion to the death of the other. And so it's this context dependent, and also the idea that we are shaped both by our biology that leads us to respond and share the suffering, but also to ideologies that put us at a distance, dehumanize the other, and maybe in certain extreme occasions also generate pleasure at the death of the other. So indeed, context I think is essential, and education as well. That's why I've written, for instance, a book against fascism, because what the danger of fascism is that it sets up an opposition within us, human, and them, less than human. And once you set up such an opposition, the step to violence, I think, is very close when you lose sight of the humanity of the other. There is, by the way, speaking of aesthetics, a TV series called Black Mirror, and I've engaged with it from the angle of posthumanism because it's a TV series about the dangers of technologies. But there is an episode, I don't remember the title, in which soldiers are somehow blinded to the humanity of those that they're supposed to exterminate and make them appear so that they don't see humans, but they see monsters. And I think it's a good illustration of what we're talking about, that ideology can dehumanize the other to the point of depriving us of any sympathy, which is a human sentiment.
Right. So considering violent representations and simulated immersion in excessively in humanity on screen and other new media platforms, do you think these turn violence into something commonplace and cathartic, thereby diluting and sublimating our destructive urges? Or do they increase our inherent cruelty by acting as a contagious disease?
Right. That's the question that I've asked in the last books that appeared this years. It was supposed to be one book titled Violence in the Unconscious, From Catharsis to Contagion, and it got too big, and so it was split in two mirroring parts. One paying attention to the catharsis hypothesis and one to the contagion hypothesis. It was an open question, because indeed you hear both sides of the stories, that looking at representations of violence can have a cathartic effect, a purifying effect, or it can generate by contagion more violence. Well, when I started reading into theories of catharsis, I realized how complicated that concept is. It's a concept that Aristotle uses in passing, once again, in the Poetics. And it says that imitations of an action in tragedy generates the catharsis of pity and fear. And usually philologists leave it untranslated because they don't know what kind of purgation, purification, cleansing, how to translate it. Strangely, though, that kind of concept, catharsis, where philologists who spend their life kind of reading the Poetics don't know what it means, has entered popular culture, and we can say, well, I went to the movie, it was a bit violent, but it was cathartic in the end. And, and so I asked myself the question, okay, I don't know exactly the answer to what is the effect of representations of violence, but what does catharsis mean? And why did the medical interpretation of catharsis become commonplace when philologists don't know what it means? And their psychoanalysis plays an important role, I think. That's why the book is about violence and relationship to the unconscious. And so I'm answering your question by saying there are different theories of the unconscious behind the catharsis hypothesis and behind the contagion hypothesis. And in a nutshell, I would say that behind the catharsis hypothesis is a psychoanalytical Oedipal theory of the unconscious. Freud, early on in his career, developed what he called the cathartic method in order to try to cure hysteria, a sickness that was popular at the time, disappeared now. And what is often not mentioned is that his uncle-in-law by marriage was a specialist of Aristotle. Freud's uncle-in-law was Jacob Bernays, who had popularized the idea that catharsis in the poetics has to do with a medical therapy. So Freud grabbed the medical interpretation of catharsis, and thanks to the success of psychoanalysis, even though Freud moved away from the cathartic method in order to develop the interpretation method that is known as psychoanalysis, it became commonplace as a term. My sense is that catharsis in Aristotle operates when there is a bodily ritual participation. It's not a question of looking at a tragedy and being cured. There is no indication that people go to the theater in the 3rd century before Christ because they're sick. And by the way, I mentioned in passing, the paradigmatic example of Aristotle's tragedy that generates catharsis is, of course, Oedipus Rex. So that there is an Oedipal theory of the unconscious behind the cathartic method from the very beginning, from Aristotle to Freud. And that genealogical connection made me suspicious of the cathartic method. I think that representations of violence, if repeated, can not purify us medically, but desensitize us of violence. And that process of being numbed, so to speak, to violence can have the opposite effect when confronted with real violence. And so that leads to the second hypothesis, which is the contagious or the affective hypothesis, as I call it, which rests on a very different unconscious, which is more embodied. It's not the Oedipal triangular unconscious. Notice again the similarities between Girard and Freud. It's always kind of this triangular structure. In the case of the mimetic unconscious, it's an embodied physio-psychological unconscious that tends to mirror, by way of contagion, the affects that we are exposed to. And if they're positive emotions, and if they're negative, the emotions are negative. So I'm more inclined, even though I don't deny that catharsis can operate in certain context, ritual context especially, I'm more inclined to think that the contagious or affective hypothesis is the one that we should more worry about, especially given the prevalence of violence, not so much in only in film, but where violence is always part of an aesthetic structure. But also in video games, where it's a question of participation in violence, and especially in younger generations. So I think that there is more to be concerned about the potential pathological effect, even though it's really a complicated question, because a lot of contextual factors play a role, like education, obviously gun availability. So I'm not arguing for a one-to-one correlation that obviously, watching violent movies will generate violent behavior. It depends a lot on context.
Right. So when you refer to our mimetic unconscious and how since birth, through the mirror neurons, it causes relational, affective, and physical changes and continues to do so, especially when exposed to crowd behaviors or hypnotic forms of fascist forces, I wonder how you are negotiating between the unconscious that is exceptionally singular, mine, yours, it's an individualistic, and a collective or community that shares certain specific histories and hatred towards the minorities. So, or are you suggesting that the mimetic unconscious also directs us towards a collective unconscious?
Yeah, here the difference between the Oedipal unconscious and the mimetic unconscious thing is important to emphasize. In the Oedipal unconscious, it's a question of interpreting the individual dreams, for instance, right, of the patient. So that the unconscious is located in the psyche of the individual. The mimetic unconscious is by definition relational. so that you're always already part of a relation when the unconscious activates. A newborn smiling when you smile. From the very beginning of one life, newborns are able to respond unconsciously to facial expression or as part of a group, of a collective. So I would say that the relational dimension of the mimetic unconscious negotiates the relation between the individual and the collective. But from the very beginning, we are dealing with an individual that is not, as in the etymology of individual, indivisible. We are relational, porous creatures. That doesn't mean, though, that we are deprived of individuality. It only means that we are shaped more than we think of the values of our surroundings, starting with parents, obviously, but not only parents, the community, the media we watch. And so it's always a question of negotiating that relation between individual difference and the danger of collective sameness that is contextual dependent. And I would argue that, yes, we notice every time we travel, whenever we are not in our context and we speak a different language and we're out of step somehow with the culture. And I think it's still Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil who argues that within a community that we know from birth, we understand others much faster, much more quickly. We can sympathize more directly. It's just easier. But it doesn't mean that we share the same unconscious, but just that we are shaped by a similar culture, and therefore we have more in common than other culture, and that facilitates a mimetic relation. But that doesn't mean, once again, that we cannot develop a distance from this mimetic pathos and develop individual features. So it's a yes or no answer. I would also say that if this unconscious is relational, it's not the kind of collective unconscious that psychoanalysts like Carl Jung discuss. I was interested early on in my career in Jung theory of the collective unconscious, but he has in mind collective archetypes that are transhistorical and that are not determined by any kind of cultural formations. They appear in different ways in different cultures, but it's the same archetype, the wise man or the anima. And it's not that kind of collective unconscious that I'm interested in, because it is always shaped. An archetype is an essence of sort. It's a nature of sort, to come back to your question. Whereas the mimetic unconscious is always shaped by the culture we live in. And so it's much more plastic, to use Catherine Malabou's term.
Right. So you're of the opinion, in the book, you're of the opinion that violent fictional spectacles on screen and new media platforms have hypermimetic effects on viewers, which in turn generate pathological drives and violent reactions. You have also mentioned some cases in the US. So if I believe this to be true, then how do we deal with the freedom of the artist? And that's one of the most, I think, dangerous questions again. So are we then prescribing a set of moral ethical codes on filmmakers and performative artists to create their work in a responsible manner?
Right. So whenever we address that question, the phantom of censorship, or even worse, kind of banning the arts altogether from the city, it's a Platonic solution, right? Comes to mind. And so no, that's not what I'm arguing. So the approach is not, let's say, moralistic. And censorship is not a solution, but being a Nietzschean, I approach the problematic from a diagnostic point of view. I think that artists always work not with violence as such. It's not violence in itself that interests a filmmaker. If you think of examples like Quentin Tarantino, and it's always highly crafted within what Aristotle would call a plot. And I think that the aesthetic context we were talking about before really matters, so that it's not simply a question of representing violence realistically, but mediating that violence within a given aesthetic form that, once again, doesn't cause automatically or trigger violence. So no, my concern is not moralistic. I wouldn't argue for censorship. It's more a question of diagnostic awareness. And maybe, what I can take from Plato, I don't take the censorship or exclusion of art, obviously, but he has a concern with education. His concerns are pedagogical, with the paideia, to use the Greek term. And he worries that if children are exposed in early age, it's almost a quote from the Republic, the book 2 or 3 of the Republic. If children are exposed in early age to violent spectacles like the Iliad, that's what he has in mind, and it's an age in which they cannot discern what is true and what is not true, that can have a negative effect in the formation of character. And so it's not a question of banning the arts. I think though parents should be responsible and aware that representations are not just representations. It's not just shadows, and it's not just an appearance or an illusion, but they do have material effects. These effects are complex. It's not deterministic. But if you are unlucky to live in a country where there is easy gun availability, for instance, which is a major factor for violence, thinking of the OS, for instance, where there is not a strong educative system, where familial structures are falling apart, and so forth, my suggestion is to be careful in early on in childhood to what we show. Maybe I mention it as an anecdote because it's what started this concern, or these books on violence in the unconscious. It wasn't just a theoretical concern, but it was practical. And I mention it in passing in the book Violence in the Mimetic Unconscious, or actually tell the story. I was living in Baltimore at the time when I started thinking about these issues in 2015, I think it was. And my son was going to a preschool, an African-American preschool, and he was walking to school, and I would walk with him in the morning. And one morning we arrive at the school, and the school is closed. And my son is obviously happy that the school is closed, but there seemed to be a strange air and an air of nervousness around the school. And so when I arrived home, I realized that an email had come in, and that announced that there had been an accident at the school, and a preschooler in my son's parallel class, so he was 5 years old at the time, had killed himself. That's what the message said. And so I followed up with a question: how is that possible that a 5-year-old child kills himself? Certainly not intentionally. So there too, the question of intentionality is problematized. And it turned out indeed that he found a loaded gun in his house. The father happened to be a policeman, and the gun was loaded. And whatever happened, he pointed the gun at himself and died. My question there is, what happens if a child sees repeatedly in cartoons or video games characters pointing the gun at themselves and generating an hilarious effect? And very often we have figures like Bugs Bunny and so forth, and we think of cartoons are harmless, but that gesture of pointing the gun at the self in a preschooler can be a deadly example. And so that was the starting point. And once again, I'm not arguing for a one-to-one connection, because I think, guns shouldn't be available. Obviously, should be way more difficult to access guns in the US, and that is the main problem. But representations of violence might have devastating effects, depending on the context.
Right. So this is a very personal question again, which happened a week ago or so. So recently, a Muslim colleague of mine from Kashmir asked a few unsettling questions about gays and violence. So there was something like this. So he asks, if being a Hindu in a Hindu majority country like India, you look at a burning body of a lynched Muslim, what will your reactions be? Similarly, what if the charred body is of a Hindu person? And are these the same feelings that we have when we look at, let's say, the dead children of Gaza? So he said he was simply afraid as a Muslim minority. So my question is, what do you think of such community-based, gender-based, individual-based reactions towards violence? Perhaps what I'm trying to ask is, are we at a risk of straitjacketing the numerous effects initiated by violence by resorting just to the mimetic and unconscious and its contagion-like effects?
Right. Yes, it's a difficult question. And as I mentioned, the mimetic unconscious has both a physiological and neurological basis that is shared across human. And then I use the concept of mimesis, which is a cultural concept. And so that has to do not with nature, but with culture. And so the distinction between nature and culture is something that the concept tries to complicate and break down. As I mentioned before, this brings us back to the question we had before. I think that there is indeed the risk in given context where a clear-cut ideological barrier sets up a violent hierarchy between self and others. I think that the risk is pretty strong in having a very different form of emotional response when somebody of our community suffers and when somebody of the other community, the less human community, suffers. I think that is once again the effect of the cultural ideological influences that if they're imbued from childhood on, and that was Plato's concern, can really generate radical emotions that you could argue go counter the natural response to share the suffering of the other. So I would say the concern is legitimate in certain contexts. And if you're unfortunate to live in a segregated, violent society where conflict and a history of oppression, I'm thinking, yes, of Gaza, as you mentioned, then it's going to be very difficult to keep a distance and to consider the other with the same sympathy as those of your community. So I think it's the concern is legitimate. At the same time, what I found hopeful is that we have the ability, all humans have the ability to respond with compassion. And there it's a question, once again, of education and training. And that's why it matters so much how the mimetic unconscious is shaped within one's community, school system, and family, so as to resonate, to use Harmut Rosa's concept, with differences of all sort, gender, race, religion, and so forth, to develop that early on. But it needs to be trained. It needs to be developed on the basis of everyday practices. And so I think that there is work for the humanities, because the humanities is very often a good space to provide a sensitive relation to the respect of differences and the tolerance with respect to of difference. So there is work. Mimetic studies, as I said, I think is something that should be important in the 21st century, especially as we see the rise of the contagious and pathological form of mimesis, and we should balance it with a positive form of imitation.
Right, and here's my last question. So what is the future of the Homo Mimeticus in the current humanities that you just mentioned, of course, also, that is taking a neo-materialist and non-human turn?
Homo mimeticus is not restricted to only humans. I speak about animal mimicry, and it's a question of going beyond nature and culture and thinking about forms of imitation that are not restricted to anthropocentrism. So I speak about animal mimicry, and also in dialogue with new materialist thinkers like Jane Bennett or William Connolly, who also happen to be contributors to mimetic studies. I'm interested in thinking about the future transformations of Homo mimeticus. If we return to where we started, and you asked about the essence of Homo mimeticus. If Homo mimeticus has no essence, but is shaped by culture, by context, by politics, then there is work to be done in order to promote positive transformations for the future. And the hope of mimetic studies is that once we become aware of the mimetic, how deep the mimetic foundation of subjectivity goes, then we can work more actively in fashioning the self and communities in a way that is sympathetically and open to all kinds of differences and promoting life affirmative forms of being, also in light of the climate crisis. So I would say that the future of Homo mimeticus is already in progress. One has to do with, indeed, the concern with the posthuman and the impact of AI simulations. So we are working on that. Mimesis is obviously at play in non-human technologies that need to be studied because they can cut both ways. So what was true of Homo mimeticus remains true of Homo mimeticus 2.0. It goes beyond good and evil, and it needs to be diagnosed. And at the same time, a major challenge is, of course, the climate crisis and the natural catastrophes that are bound to ensue, or that continue to ensue, already happen. And so for that, a notion of metamorphosis, a positive notion of metamorphosis, I would say it's the offspring of the Homo Mimeticus project. And it's no accident that the seminar that we are running now, it's called Metamorphosis of Mimesis, as a continuation to think about positive transformation in the age of the Anthropocene.
Right, fantastic. So the session is now open for questions. We'll take a couple of them maybe, if someone has. It's open to the audience. Anyone wants to ask anything to Professor Lawtoo, you can switch on your camera, audio, or write anything if you have any questions. You can just switch on your audio and video and ask.
If anything is unclear, it's your occasion to ask. Otherwise, you'll have to read the books.
It's always a good occasion, though. Right. Okay, I don't think we have much questions today, so we can wrap the session up. So thank you so much, Professor Lawtoo, for your fantastic reflections on mimesis, mind, balance, Nietzsche, Girard.
Asijit.
Yes.
Asijit.
Yes.
I have a small, actually, it's not a question. I actually wanted to say how, enlightening the lecture was. Thank you, Professor. It was a very knowledge providing, and as well as the idea that you developed about the morality fact was something very singular and something that always had me thinking about a lot of things that you spoke about, like when we are talking about mimesis, we always tend to have this more of a moralistic idea about it, and your departure from that is something that that is really needs to be thought about by everybody that heard, and I'm very thankful to you. So it's not a question, it's just an appreciation. So thank you for it.
Thank you very much for your appreciation. Indeed, it's not a moralistic approach, and what I meant also by it, it's that there are no fixed rules or imperative or commandments that can be applied to mimesis, but that doesn't mean that the question of ethics and what is just should not be central to reflections of mimetic studies. But those are always contextual dependent, and that's why I emphasize the plurality of pathologies, because we need to draw on competences that come from specific communities where the problematic is known from within. And so it's not a question of saying in general what is good or what is bad, but we need specific diagnostic evaluations. So thank you for
your comment. Thank you, sir. Thank you a lot for providing this diagnostic and pathologic discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, for your observation. Vandana, do you have a question?
Right.
Yes.
I'll be very quick. Thank you, Asijit, and thank you very much, Professor Lawtoo. We're almost out of time, so I will probably just refer to the last part of your conversation and the importance of education as a space where many of the challenges that you spoke about and Asijit brought up need to be discussed, debated, rehearsed, challenged, and then perhaps something new would come out of that. Many of us are in the space of education, and we interact with students, we interact with our own children and face many of the issues that you're talking about. But again, there's no singular educational framework also, right? There is a great plurality there, and that's always a space that is challenged from every corner more and more. I'm talking about India now. So sometimes it feels like, there's perhaps no way out, right? In trying to create the minimum benchmark, which is respect for difference, right? What are the boundaries of acceptable violence and violence that is not acceptable? So I don't, of course, think there are clear answers to these questions, but to keep the discussion alive, to keep the idea of respect for diversity and difference and plurality alive, what can we think about as educators? What should be our agenda, which seems to be more and more blurred as the days goes by, for pushing for a framework that respects this? And you're absolutely right, humanities and social sciences are some of the most liminal spaces left where people even ask these questions. In many of the other domains, these questions are not even asked. It's all about, capitalist development of science and technology and so on and so forth. So what are the guiding posts left for people in the humanities and social sciences and those who are in education is something, we keep chatting about also with our colleagues, but it'd be great to hear from you what you think about this. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a great and difficult and important question. I mentioned early on that philosophers remember Plato's exclusion, a kind of authoritarian exclusion of the poets from the city, but he was very concerned with education, and I think it's a question of taking, from different traditions. In the Homo Mimeticus book, I draw primarily on a Western tradition, but all traditions have texts that need to be reinterpreted, and that have been shaping the culture for very long. And indeed, the short-term range kind of target, objective, quantifiable results that drive a lot of research these days, I think benefits from being complemented from narrative, for instance. What happens in a story? Whenever you read a story, independently of its origin, be it a novel or a poem, there is an identification with a perspective that is not ours. And very often great texts from the tradition, be it the Gita or the Odyssey or a Native American myth, allow for a kind of identification with differences. And my experience is that from very early on with my children, if one starts early, it's automatic, this ability to identify and empathize with very different scenarios. And I experienced it with my children. It becomes more difficult later on as ideologies come in and set up those hierarchies and boundaries that we spoke of. But I think that indeed the ability to bring in the classroom specific text in the broad sense, be it a novel or be it a film or be it a documentary, we have the advantage of operating in a moment in life, let's say up to university, 25 years or 23 years, where students' brain is very plastic, as Catherine Malabou would say. And very often it's not a question of quantity, but one encounter with a strong teacher can really modify a position that was shaped previously by the ideologies that set up the differences and the oppositions that you mentioned. So I think that very often teachers are not valued enough, are underpaid, and I think in different places. It's a difficult job. But one of the psychologists that I discuss in the Phantom of the Ego book is called Pierre Janet, and he has been forgotten because of the success of psychoanalysis. But he says we should pay attention more to intersubjectivity. And he speaks of a psychology of the socius. And socius is the term, it's a term that Deleuze uses as well, but Janet uses it before him. It's a term that has to do with a model that is not simply exterior to the self, but becomes part of the self. Obvious examples are parents. But then he also lists teachers, a second in the list. And I think that as teachers, we can operate as a socius, as figures that do not stimulate archetypes that are already there in the brain, but can put children in touch with traditions, or students in touch with tradition, by a text that lead already to a mimetic identification, because literature and film are mimetic media par excellence. Those chains, as I said before, they're not only negative, they can be really a power they have liberating powers built in them. So that if we identify with an oppressed figure in a film, we can make the link from aesthetics to reality. We often see how that link from social media to reality can be thin and porous in the negative sense. In my books, I talk about, for instance, January 6th, the storming of the US Capitol, how spreading fictions via social media can generate to a physical insurrection. And we shouldn't forget that it also operates in the other way, for the positive, that texts have the power to generate sympathy that operates in real life as well. And so I don't have magic formulas, unfortunately, but just being aware of the porosity of those boundaries, I think can give us kind of value and continue in the missions of teaching, which I think is one of the most important job after parenting that there is, because it has to do with shaping the next generations. So I don't have a formula, but I think that in mimesis there is as much as the worst as the best of humans, and being aware of that can put our, emphasize the fact that we can put our energies to the development of the best via the texts that we love, and share that passion, because the passion of the humanities tends to be contagious. People go into teaching very often because they had early on teachers that inspired them. And so it's like a chain. Nietzsche said it's a long chain that goes from ancient times into the present. We are part of that long chain. So there is hope in that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think very powerful words and very inspiring words to hear that from you. Thank you. Thanks,
Right.
Asijit.
For your question.
Thank you so much, Vandana. We have one more question from Abdul. It's a huge question. So would you like to, maybe compress it and ask it directly to Professor Lawtoo? Switch on your audio, maybe. Could you do that? Because it's a huge question. Okay. I think if I can compress it myself, I think what he wants to ask is, was it that violence seems to attract audience more than before nowadays? People are blindly running towards dark contents. Is it becoming an attitude to find amusement in everything? Or is it our indifference to sensitive impulses causing this? That's, I think, basically his question.
Yes, it's more visible now because of the new media, I would say. Violence has always been present. I mentioned, the tragedies, and in ancient texts, you have stories of wars and battles. But now, indeed, the new social media capitalize on the brain's receptivity to violent behavior from a distance, in order to generate retweets and likes and stimulation. And it seems that the engineers that are programming the new medias are very good psychologists, unfortunately. Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals that, yes, there is this tendency in humans that inflicting violence does us good, he says, even as radical as that. And so watching violent spectacles has that kind of strange paradoxical effect. So it generates more likes. We see it at play in politicians that exploit violent emotions on social media, and taking distance there from social media and channeling or emotional energy via maybe older media as well, and being face to face with real people, because it's more difficult to be violent in a real to life situation. You think twice, especially depending on the size of the person and the number of people. Whereas retweet, there is no risk, right? Insulting people online, there is no risk. So being out in an immanent world with other people, I think grounds us and allows for those feeling of sympathy, which are really natural to humans, and from birth onward are as powerful as the violent ones. The danger of living in a world of simulations and seeing violence and kind of retweeting violent content is that we lose touch with reality, with the reality of our bodies, and so yes, spending time in interactions face to face. It's a pity that we cannot have a real seminar, but this conversation is nonetheless allows for in-depth dialogue and back and forth. So we can use the social media for the good, but embodied conversations are important as well.
Right. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so. Okay. So let's conclude the session. So thank you so much, Professor Lawtoo, for your fantastic reflections on mimesis, mind, balance, Nietzsche, Girard, Malibu. It was absolutely thought-provoking. I hope we'll have such sessions with you in the near future. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
Thank you so much, Asijit. It's a wonderful discussion, excellent questions, and it was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.